programming. I'm excited this evening to bring you the last program in our Spring Brainwave series. Each year, Brainwave brings mind scientists and those from other walks of life together to dive a little bit deeper into different topics to help us learn more about ourselves. This year, we have been focusing entirely on power. For those that have not been to the museum before, all of our exhibitions and programs have taken a different take on power, not only how it manifests within us, but also between us. So, how can failure factor into this conversation? Tonight we're talking about the power of failure and how it might teach us lessons and propel us forward. Perhaps in the context of this museum, the power of failure might best be exemplified by the notion of reincarnation, and how our failures in one life can still give rise to opportunity to try and try and try again. Here to talk about his own experience with not only fame, but failure, is singer, songwriter, musician, DJ, and photographer Moby. We're celebrating the launch of the second volume of his extraordinary life story, titled Then It Fell Apart. Some of you have already purchased this book. We will also have it available in the shop after, and Moby will be signing copies upstairs. I hope you'll join us after the program as well. We're also celebrating the 20th anniversary of the hit album Play. Picking up where this first memoir, Porcelain, left off, Then It Fell Apart artfully merges childhood memories with the outlandish stories from whirlwind years of fame. A little later, Moby will be joined by Dr. Moran Cerf to provide the scientific perspective. He's a regular to our Brainwave stage. Dr. Cerf is a professor of neuroscience and business at the Kellogg School of Management and the neuroscience program at Northwestern University. His research focuses on understanding the underlying mechanisms of our psychology, and he's discussed aspects of his research on behavior changes, emotion, decision-making, and dreams with actors Giancarlo Esposito and Jake Gyllenhaal here at the Rubin in previous years. Recently, his focus has been on the neural mechanisms that underlie decision-making, offering a new perspective on predicting future choices and investigating how much free will we have in our decisions. He'll lend his knowledge to talk a little bit more about failure as well with Moby. So please help me welcome Moby to the stage.
Hi, everybody. So, Dr. Cerf, are you here, Dr. Cerf? There you are. Hi. So, what, like 10 minutes you want to come up and we'll talk? So, they asked me if I wanted to give some sort of quasi-TED talk. I gave a real TED talk about a year ago about animal rights and why I'm a vegan. Thank you. And so what I want to talk about is failure. Keep in mind, I have not prepared anything. I lied. I take that back. Just now, backstage, I wrote down a few words. And so basically, everybody, myself included, we hate failure, correct? To the point where preemptively, we will avoid things that even have the most remote potential for failure. Or we engage in things, and when they start failing, at least speaking for myself, I panic more than I panic about anything else. I opened a restaurant in Los Angeles, and now it's doing great. When we first opened, it was a disaster. I mean, the first couple of weeks were it's just abysmal disaster. And I would wake up every night panicking. Luckily, I've done cognitive behavioral therapy. I've been a meditator for a long time. So I have a different relationship towards panic. I can observe the panic and say okay, and this is sort of a tangent, but at 3 o'clock in the morning when I'm panicking about whether my restaurant is going to fail or not, my first question is one, what can I do about it now? And the answer is, it's 3 o'clock in the morning, I can't do anything. Two, the other question is isn't this fascinating that my brain has been completely hijacked by terror even though quite literally everything around me is as perfect as anything has ever been for a human being ever. And this was real. Like, so I'd be lying in bed, 3 o'clock in the morning, like just losing my mind with this panic, and then saying like, okay, but I am in a climate-controlled house. I have access to clean water. I have access to all the beautiful food I've ever wanted to eat. I am surrounded by organic cotton. Like this is as nice, like, and if anything goes wrong, like, there are ambulances that will come and take me and look after my health. Like, if someone tries to break into my home, the police will be here with helicopters right away. Like, things are perfect, and I'm afraid of thoughts. And that is, I mean, a much longer conversation, like the meaning, almost like on a semiotic level, the meaning that we give the potential for failure. But what I think is interesting, at least for myself, and I assume for everyone here, is when I've failed, and I've failed many times. I have failed publicly, I have failed privately, I have failed qualitatively, I have failed quantitatively. In any way you can fail, pretty much I've failed. And I hate it when I'm going through it. And I even hate it sometimes after I've gone through it. But what's so interesting, and this is sort of what I wanted to talk about, is, at least for me, I've learned more from failure than from any of the successes that I've had. In both strategic ways and also in terms of like existential ways. Strategically, what I mean is like, when in 1999, I released the album Play, and it, air quote, succeeded, and I learned nothing from it. But in fact, it was delusion. It fed my delusion. I was like, oh, it's succeeding because I'm great and special. That was not why it was succeeding. It was, who knows what chaos theory variables contributed to its success, but like, I was a very small part of it. But success is delusional, and it makes me think it's me. Like, I'm the reason this is succeeding, you know? And obviously history is filled with people like that, you know, like Napoleon outside Moscow, like, this has to succeed because I'm special. It's like, no, you're just a little guy with a overactive libido. But then failure, when something fails, that forces you to learn. Like, you're like, well, why did this fail? Like, you deconstruct it. You're like, okay, what could I have done differently? But then, and this to me is the most interesting aspect, hopefully and relevant for you guys as well, is the relationship that we have to failure over time. Because I would say my life is filled with things that were failures, that became neutral, that became things that I'm eternally grateful for. So the action or the experience itself hasn't changed. You know, like, let's say, like, for example, in 2002, I released an album called 18, and it didn't really fail. I'll even go a couple years after. 2004, I released an album called Hotel, and in the United States, it failed. Boy, oh boy, did it fail. It was the front page of the New York Times, their website. They had a review of this album, Hotel. It sat there for a week. The reviewer hated it so much, he said that the album represented the end of music. It sold nothing. None of the videos got played on MTV. Radio didn't play it. And that review was like sort of representative of what the other reviews were like. People, I was done. Like, in the United States, like, people hated it. This was failure. You know, my record label stopped returning calls. And then the next album after that also quantifiably failed. And at the time, it drove me insane. And now, as weird as this might sound, I'm so grateful for it. Because if those hadn't failed, I would have sort of like stumbled along with delusion. Or even like my reliance on alcohol and drugs, I failed, I bottomed out, and I hated the fact that I could no longer drink, I could no longer do drugs. And so now, bottoming out as an alcoholic and a drug addict, having albums that were described as the end of music on the New York Times webpage. I still want to find that guy and stab him in the throat. I'm a progress, not perfection. And But these things, like, I am so grateful for where I am today. I mean, literally, this is really nice. But also the perspective that I have. And the perspective I have is very much, by definition, the product of everything I've experienced. And the failure was more educational and more corrective than any success I've ever had. So I guess that's the reason I want to talk about failure, is just simply, if you're going through failure, if you might have experienced failure, whether it's a relationship, whether it's a job, whether it's family, whether it's health, where it's whatever, like, if you can, this has helped me, just realize that, like, we are not omniscient. You know, and judgment is basically 180 degrees opposed. Like, judgment has to be based on omniscience or else it's flawed. And we're not omniscient, so that means by definition all judgment is flawed. You know, you cannot be omniscient. We are making huge sweeping generalizations based on tiny bits of information. Just accept that and just simply say, like, okay, this thing I'm going through, this failure, this thing I hate, this breakup, this job, this whatever, this health thing, give it the potential to change, because it will, and there's a better than likely chance the thing that you hate today will be the thing that you're grateful for tomorrow. So that's my little spiel on failure. Should we talk about more failure stuff? And by the way, for a minute, I only saw this glass of water, and I thought that you were doing some sort of like Skinner box like test on me, like one glass of water, and who's gonna like reach for the glass of water.
It's all yours, and we have a...
And then I saw you have yours over there, so obviously...
How do you feel about your 10-minute talk? Was it successful?
The nice thing is, I like the idea. Obviously, it's nice to do something and have people laugh, and it's nice to think like, oh, I didn't sound stupid. I might have even sounded at times coherent. But the other thing, one of the greatest realizations that I ever had, and I mean, a lot of my epiphanies are really banal and self-evident, but this one, it was a couple of years ago, I was hiking in Griffith Park in Los Angeles, and it was one of those beautiful February days where it was like 72 degrees, sunny, breezy, the air smelled like sage and orange blossom, and I thought to myself, okay, if my last record had sold 10 million copies, none of this would be different. If my last relationship had worked out, none of this would be different. Realizing like no one, like basically the only power that people have over you is the power that your brain gives them. You know, like, and just that emancipation. So basically if I stand up here and humiliate myself and sound like an idiot, and everyone here is like, what an idiot, I don't care. It's sort of nice to just be like, there's the liberation of having a sense of self and a sense of self-worth that is not contingent upon the opinions of strangers.
Other than the New York Times guys. That's the...
He is a dead man walking, as far as I'm...
Okay. So I should say, as we start, that we did not prepare anything. This is our basically first meeting, and we had 1 minute before that we kind of try to think what to say, and Moby said, let's not prepare everything because it's going to be more spontaneous. So against all of my judgments, which you can say I have printout notes and additional notes from the 10 minutes that he spoke, I'm going to try to improvise. How was writing the book? How was the experience?
It was great. So the book, there's 2 parts to the book. There's childhood and adulthood. It was sort of inspired by Slaughterhouse-Five, the Kurt Vonnegut book, because he does a lot of sort of like temporal jumping around. And what I wanted to do is, because the adulthood, it ends, this is spoiler alert, it ends with me getting sober. But it's sort of, the adult, because I wrote a book 3 years ago that is the middle, it's the part of my life that's not covered in this book, because I'm a completely self-involved narcissist, and that's what, if you're a narcissist and sober in middle age, you write memoirs. So I wanted, the adult part of this book, the fame, alcoholism, drug addiction, entitlement, debauchery, degeneracy, I wanted to provide a sort of grounded contextualization for it. Because a lot of times when we talk about people like bottoming out, you don't understand what has contributed to it. You know, like why are they making these choices? Because at the time, I thought I was behaving in a very rational, self-interested way by being an entitled, narcissistic, alcoholic, fame-obsessed drug addict. Like to me, I was like, oh, this makes sense, you know, and obviously like childhood trauma, childhood dysfunction does sort of contextualize it. So writing it, and this is, I cannot recommend this more highly, regardless of what you've done with your life, at some point write a memoir. Because like we've all been to therapy, right? I mean, you are a therapist, I assume that part of are you a therapist?
This is a therapy.
Okay. Free therapy. This is great. So therapy is interesting because therapy, like you sort of prioritize the trauma and your description tends to be an emotional description. You know, the classic question, how do you feel? And the question is not, what did the air smell like? What clothes were you wearing? Like, it's not somatic descriptions, it's how did you feel, which is relevant and great. Or when we tell stories, it tends to be like quick and glib. Writing a memoir, you have to flesh things out in great detail, and so you learn about the past in ways that you normally don't have access to. And so that's why I highly recommend at some point, just write a 50-page memoir. Take some bits from your life and flesh them out and give them color and somatic depth, and you'll learn about yourself in ways that otherwise you probably might not.
So I already have thoughts that I'm going to share in a second about the science, but tell me about the experience then. So it feels, when you read the book, that it is kind of like a cathartic therapy. You actually go into a lot of difficult experiences. And actually, I listened to the book as an audiobook with your voice reading it. And what struck me as interesting is how calm you are when you talk about pretty difficult moments in your life, sexual abuse, death in the family, a lot of difficult things. Get a very calm voice that kind of is soothing and makes the reader go through those easily. How was the experience of writing day to day? Did you wake up in the morning and start writing? Did you just took a break for a week and said, I'm going to sit in somewhere by myself and write? How was it going? Like, how did the therapy writing work?
I tend to work a lot. Like, I don't really I don't differentiate between my work life and the rest of my life. Like, so I write, I work on music, I work on a lot of other things, very much integrated. It's not like I start at 8 and finish at 5. Sometimes you start at 6, sometimes you start at noon. Sometimes you do other things, sometimes you write for 10 minutes, sometimes you write for 3 hours. It's all very kind of random, steady random, but integrated.
Who read the book first when you finished it?
Well, there's a man named Gavin who was my sort of day-to-day editor. So I guess him. And then I sent it to the editor who published my first memoir, and he rejected it. So that made me feel great. And it was interesting because then I was like, oh no, have I written a bad book? Like, authors make bad books, musicians make bad songs, directors make bad movies. So I had this moment where I was like, oh no, this experienced editor has rejected my book. And I didn't, but it's also fascinating, my immediate assumption was, oh, I'm bad and I've done something bad. As opposed to saying, like, I'm not a mind reader. I don't know what variables are in, like, maybe he's like, oh, I'm leaving the company, or the first book didn't sell as well as we wanted, so we're not ready to commit to this book, or we're not looking to do more memoir. Like, there could have been any other reasons. I never asked him, but my immediate assumption was like, I'm a terrible author and this is a bad book. So.
And how did you come out of it?
By sending it to other people and having them say it was a good book.
Okay, so that is a theme in the book that comes up many times, that a lot of the experiences in your life require validation from the outside world. Women get a lot of chapters. Audience, other successful musicians, it seems like for a while this is a driving factor. First of all, is it the case? Am I reading correctly? Has it changed? Why?
Oh, yeah. Well, yes, that external validation drove, I would say, everything or almost everything for me, personally, professionally. Everything was about validation. Like even the promiscuity in the book, it's not about sex, it's about affirmation and validation. You know, like rather than have a one-night stand, if I had just sat down with someone and they'd looked at me and said, oh, I see who you are, I think you have worth, I'm attracted to you, let's just leave it at that, fine. That would have been a perfect one-night stand. Not nearly as anecdotal, but so by that external validation, and I think you could argue that part of it, and this is an interesting, I was in a type of therapy about 8 years ago, and I don't remember what type of therapy it was, but one of the things I got out of it was, because traditionally, like I was in dynamic psychoanalysis on Central Park West for a while, because I'm a cliched New Yorker. I mean, how many people here have been in dynamic psychoanalysis on the Upper West Side, right? Come on. Liars. And so I did that, and that was interesting because that was very focused on me and my experience. And this other type of therapy that I don't remember the name of tried to contextualize it within the broader human condition. You know, it had a sort of almost like a hereditary existential component to it, which I thought was very interesting because we're all accustomed to thinking of our issues as being ours, as opposed to what are the issues that we have or the proclivities we have that are shared with every human being on the planet. And so looking for validation, like we are a gregarious culture, like, and we exist in relation to other people. So like when I was looking for validation, sure, part of that was my own insecurity and it was very specifically relevant to me, but part of it's just our species, you know, like, and so in a way, like I love throwing myself under the bus and criticizing myself and like pointing out my own dysfunction. But I think that desire for validation is something that is shared by the majority of people on the planet. It's just when you recognize that it's unhealthy, irrational, and no benefit is being created for you or others, then that's when it's time to sort of, if you can, move past it.
So I have another question, but I'm curious about one thing that I didn't plan to ask at all that comes up right now. Since you speak right now with a very kind of broad perspective on the past, as if it's over, if I talk to you 10 years ago, what would be the answer then to the same questions? Would you say, no, it's great, validation is great, or I don't need validation? What would be like, is it the last 10 years that everything changed, or the last 5 minutes because there's an audience here, or me? What's the real answer from 10 years ago?
I don't know if because I got sober 10 years ago, and pre-sobriety is very different than post-sobriety. And obviously things change. It's not like this binary switch, like you get sober and suddenly you see everything differently. But pre-sobriety, I was much more feral in a longing for like immediate gratification that was incredibly selfish. You know, like when I dated people, there wasn't much concern for them. It was like, how does it make me feel? You know, journalists, everything was like, how does it affect me? You know, this weird sort of feral narcissism. And so the validation thing, it's that question like back then, and so I remember as a hopefully relevant tangent, early on in sobriety, I was in a group therapy setting, and we were it was a 12-step group therapy thing, and we were talking about lying. And my immediate thought was like, we're going to talk about our history with dishonesty and lying. And I was like, well, I don't think I'm a liar. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh, everything is a lie. Like every way in which I've misrepresented myself, it's all lies. Like there are actual lies. Shut up. Kidding. No, it's fine. It's fine. We have phones. They ring. It's no big deal. Yeah, it might be important. Yeah. Probably is. Yeah. So So dishonesty. So the question being, if we were to talk, let's say 12 years ago, is one, my comfort with misrepresentation and also my awareness of misrepresentation. Like, there's a good chance that I would have answered in what seemed like I would have answered in an honest way, but it wasn't honest. You know, if we have no self-awareness, our honesty is by definition not inherently honest.
And you made some of your greatest album in the years that you feel were not authentic. Is that a worry that you have right now that everything is a lot more stable, things are going to be different in your music?
I don't know. I mean, luckily no one buys music, so I'll never find out. So that's an interesting question. I mean, because like, I haven't thought about that. I guess there was, I don't know. I don't know how to answer, because it's also that question like, why make music? What do I hope from it? And like nowadays, like again, no one buys it anyway, but like I make it for the love of making it, and I make it because it seems like music especially has the ability to represent feelings, perspectives, what have you, in a way that our spoken language can't. And so it's the amazing access to that, you know, to like, almost like Wittgenstein, like the opposite of like in Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, he talks about like the imperative that we have for like a language that has meaning. And music would be the exact opposite, and that's 100% subjective. You know, there's no sort of like quantifiable objective meaning to music, the way there would be with mathematics, which in the Tractatus is Wittgenstein's sort of preferred form of language. Then he came back later and said I was wrong. But so it's the utility of music, and why ever make it, you know? I mean, it's a much longer sort of like psycho-spiritual conversation about like music is one of the things that amazes me about it. And I used to work with Oliver Sacks at the Institute for Music and Neurologic Function. And we would work on music as an actual healing modality, you know, that affects the endocrine system, that promotes neurogenesis, it decreases stress hormones. It's a powerful healing modality that actually like it can, like they were discharging early Alzheimer's patients from the Institute because they'd essentially healed them. And what fascinated me is music has never existed. And I don't mean that in a metaphoric level. I mean, music cannot exist. It's air. Music has never been created. It's kind of, and I'm not trying to sound all weird and esoteric, quite literally, music has never, ever had corporeal form. All it is air molecules vibrating a little bit differently. It doesn't create air molecules. And to think what can result from that, you know, like it can make people cry, it can make people dance, it can change the world, it can make 100,000 people at a festival jump up and down. Air molecules, nothing being created, just moving a little bit differently. So it's that power, that phenomenal non-corporeal power of music that is why I keep doing it. But maybe the music I make now that I'm middle-aged and not a bottomed-out narcissistic drunk anymore, maybe I still am a bottomed-out narcissistic drunk, maybe the music I'm making is less desperate, but it still, for me, is just as, subjectively, I get just as much out of it, if not more so.
So the topic that we spoke about before that I tried to close the loop about is social interactions. Because you said correctly, I think, in my mind, that a lot of our experience of the world is coming from the feedback we get from the outside world and how interactions happen. At the same time, in the book, there is one thing that you repeatedly fail on, which is maintaining a relationship with one person continuously. You mentioned a few women that you were able to stay with for a little longer, and then it didn't work out, and you say that you had a panic attack every time it seemed to become a little bit more personal. Has that changed as well, or this is a residue that is in your brain?
I mean, it's changed in that I've basically given up on the hope of ever having a relationship. You know, it's like 3 years ago my last relationship ended, and I just realized, like, oh, I don't think I'll ever be in a relationship. Because, which might sound sad, but I don't know if it is. Because the other things that I'm involved, like service, creativity, health, spirituality, all these things, they feel so much more meaningful to me. And a lot of my heroes throughout history have not been people who've been in relationships. So, and it's funny, like, because for years in therapy, it was sort of like the ultimate goal of like getting healed through therapy was to like finally be in a good relationship. And at some point I was like, what if you have a great meaningful life without a relationship? You know, so I kind of want to go back to all my therapists and be like, fuck you, you were wrong.
I think you,
Stop
in the
criticizing
book,
me.
There's a part that I really found funny in the book where you talk about going to a therapist. Again, I think it was the Upper West Side, and he convinces you to go to cognitive behavioral treatment and tells you to confront the things that you don't want to do. And you say, one of the things I confronted was cocaine. I never did cocaine before. Now I'm going to do it. That's the implementation of the CBT, to now try to do cocaine, which I found not aligned with what Freud's ideas were, but perfectly aligned with the book's kind of theme.
Well, it's funny because I also, about 6 months before I got sober, I went to see a psychiatrist about getting medicated. And I didn't include this in the book, but I thought this was really funny. He was this jolly man on the Upper East Side, not the Upper West Side. I guess maybe psychologists, West Side, psychiatrists, East Side. And we were talking about my problem with drinking, with drugs, and he was so funny. I kind of want to find him and become friends with him. He said, well, if you're thinking about sobriety, my advice to you is just do more cocaine. I was like, excuse me? And he was like, oh yeah, because if you do a lot of cocaine, you'll get sober really quick. He's like, you can be a bottoming out alcoholic for decades. Trust me. He's like, cocaine will bottom you out in an instant. And guess what? He was right. You know?
So I'm supposed to give the science perspective. Here's my 2 cents right away. That's gonna add to that. So I'm gonna try to combine the drug addiction, the social interaction in the following way. There's a study that was done sometime, I want to say in the 80s, but I have to, let's say around the 80s, on drugs. And this study was cited for 30 years as the evidence that there's a problem with drugs. The study goes like that. They took 2 rats. 1 rat, 2 livers. 1 rat sits in a cage and it has 2 livers. The liver on the left, if the rat pulls it, she gets...
lever.
Yes.
I thought you were talking about liver as in like...
Okay.
I was so intrigued. I was like, they gave a rat 2 livers?
I think importantly, I was told in advance that I should speak slow.
No.
Am I?
That was the only word. I mean, I'm just amazed. I speak English. That's it. So you speak a couple languages, probably more than the 2, like Hebrew, English,
yes.
Others, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
So, like, trust me, that was not a criticism. I was just, was I the only one who thought he was saying liver?
No, this was a...
Yeah.
I embraced the failure.
Yeah. So I'm glad we clarified, because I really had this idea of a rat running around with 2 livers.
So keep being on top of things to make sure that I'm not incorrect here. The 80s, let's say, is incorrect. Otherwise, it's 2 livers that the rat has. When it pulls on the left one, let's make it a she. She gets food. So that's her way to get food. When she pulls on the right one, she gets a little zap into a part of the brain called the VTA, the ventral tegmental area, which is basically the part of the brain that gives us pleasure in a kind of boost, orgasm. Strong joy, and a lot of the joy that comes with drugs comes with basically activity in this part of the brain. So the rat has 2 options, food or momentary boost of joy. And the rats in the experiment, essentially, summarizing the result, died of starvation. So they just kept there, and in every trial they could either choose food or pleasure, and they all died of starvation because they kept choosing the addiction. And this study was used for 30 years to basically say how drugs are bad, because look at what happened to those rats. The guy who ran this study in 2011 did a done of this study with a third condition. So this time the rats have one option: food. Option 2, a boost to the joy area, or far outside, there's a little other cage with a theme park of other rats. Tons of other rats playing around, kind of, on the wheels, whatever they do. And what he shows was that when they kind of done playing with this for a few trials, they just had enough with both, and they went to play with others. And this changed the entire perspective, showing that in a way, having a social option, a third option that is social, is actually the best one for a lot of people. So having someone who reads the book first and gives you comment, good or bad, someone who talks to you, hears you, someone who gives you an option to kind of get out of it and just look at things from a different perspective is the best way. And this was implemented not just as an experiment, but in some countries where they had a big problem of drugs, like Portugal is the one example. They basically took all the money that was used to the war on drugs and moved it to all kinds of programs that take drug addicts and integrate them back in society, giving them employment, paying the employer their salary, and doing all kinds of things. And it worked magnificently in actually reducing the drug use in Portugal, and a way to basically offer a policy that takes the problem of addiction, which is that it works, and trying to offer an alternative rather than fight that. This is my science checked.
Well, I was doing an interview recently, and we were talking about the brain that responds to alcohol and drugs. And there is definitely like a hereditary component. I mean, my father was an addict. And also like my ancestors are Scottish and Irish. My home group AA meeting on the Lower East Side was in a part of New York that's traditionally very Chinese, Latino, and Jewish. And you would walk into my home group and you might as well have been in Belfast. Like, no, like it was just all like inbred, pasty white guys like me. But I was also thinking, like, in a way, like I was comparing the pre-addicted brain to like a desiccated sponge. And it might be a weird analogy, but like if you take a normal, healthy, wet sponge and you pour liquid onto it, it won't absorb it because it's already full. If you take a dry, desiccated sponge and you pour liquid onto it, boom, it pops up. And so like a brain, like in childhood, if you experience loneliness, shame, trauma, you create the neurochemical equivalent of a desiccated sponge. And so when anything hits your brain that triggers the sort of like normal emotional response that people would get from like family, community, society, what have you, the brain lights up. You know, like remember the first drink I had, I was like, oh my God, like this is great. And the same thing with drugs, but then also with music and books. Finding these things that like lit up my brain, because at an early age I realized, not consciously, but I was like, oh, the traditional things that are supposed to fill up a brain, family, attachment, community, belonging, I didn't have those things. And so the brain is still, it needs something, unless you're like a Russian orphan baby, and then it doesn't need anything, you just go around stabbing people. True. And so so what you're saying about like the rats, yeah, it's like, and really, I mean, it's interesting that we're doing this in the Rubin, because everything, and I'm stating the obvious, but we oftentimes forget about this, everything comes down to the brain. The brain has no idea what's going on. Like, as we know, and you know intimately, this is your day job, you're a PhD. I mean, I'm a college dropout, what do I know? But like, the brain is the most complicated thing the universe has ever created. We cannot even truly understand the workings of two dendrites and synapses. No way we could possibly map or fully understand it. But go for a hike, and the brain thinks that a stick is a snake. So the most complicated thing in the universe, and it's ready to get in a fight over someone taking your parking space. So the brain is like this baffled, wise, ancient, confused, modern, complicated thing locked in a box doing its best, And so that's why, I mean, like, the human condition is one of, like, just abject confusion,
I think in the book you have this sentence where at some point someone asks you as a kid, what do you want to do when you grow up? And you said that you want to be a scientist. I kind of highlighted that to myself as a note that indeed, as an adult, you get to know a lot of that. Use the brain as an example, use it in the book, you talk about it in your work, you work in this, the project with the Oliver Saxon University. It seems like it kind of came back and in a way you use it in a lot of your experiences. So
well, it's also God. Like, this is one thing that has confused me for the longest time is the sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? The adversarial, so at times adversarial relationship between spirituality and science. Because to me, everything about science points to God. And keeping in mind, I don't know what God is.
You wrote that I saw it online. It says that your religion is Taoist, Christian, agnostic, quantum mechanic. Explain.
I like all those things. I would throw in Sufi as well. I really like some Sufi stuff. I like Led Zeppelin quite a lot.
You have the phone. Go to Wikipedia and update quickly.
Yeah. What else is? I mean,
the quantum mechanics is the one I'm finding the most kind of out there. That's not in the otherwise
because even most rudimentary quantum mechanics, all it does is point to the fact that as long as we're human, we can't objectively know anything. Like the fact that we cannot understand basic quantum truths about the universe means that all of our knowledge is fun and practical in the most limited, reductionist way at best. But we take our opinions and our knowledge so seriously. And it helps. It helps us go to the moon and do stuff like that. Like we can, like build hang gliders that don't fall down. That's great, but the actual workings of the universe, we can't even begin to perceive 1/1,000,000th of it. So this is, but science to me, and maybe I'm to an extent anthropomorphizing the unknowable, but like the divine, whatever it might be. I had dinner recently with Sam Harris. Do you know Sam Harris? He's a renowned atheist. I didn't know he was an atheist. And I offended him because I used the word God during dinner, and he and his wife got so mad. And I was like, I'm sorry. Like, did I use, pedophile, is that a better word? But I was talking about God because to me, I know I'm tangenting, but God to me is shorthand for all of that. God to me is like the wonderfully benign unknowable that is somehow interested in us, And so the science aspect, science points to that. All it takes, just look at our immune system. Look at the workings of a cell. And to me, it's like, burn down the cathedrals, throw out all of the theological texts, look at a cell. If you want to learn about the divine, spend a lifetime studying a cell, and you'll begin to know 1/1,000,000th of what the divine might be.
One of the things that will tie it nicely to the theme of the evening, I think, is that science, in my mind, is one of the few fields where failure is embraced. If you fail an experiment, as long as you report it correctly, people actually find it, okay, now we know what not to try again. Now we kind of have a little different map of the experience. We know this doesn't work and this doesn't work. Maybe the failure is teaching us something. People are not at all unhappy with failures. They actually say, okay, now I know. That's going into the part of the paper that says what are the things that didn't work. And in many ways, I think scientists were ahead of a lot of us in figuring out that failures are just a way to learn more pieces of information that explains the world. So in that sense, I think that tying it nicely to the work. In your book, you talk a lot about consciousness, the way you described right now, kind of trying to talk about the universe. You meditate with David Lynch. I mean, you go meditate with David Lynch, you end up in a rave, partying.
Spoiler alert, my first attempt at, I do a lot of different types of meditation. I mean, I know we are in a Buddhist museum, which is great. Buddhism is really nice. My experience, I'm also a meditation teacher. It's one of my dirty secrets. And when I teach meditation, my approach is like, whatever works for the person who's meditating. Like, I hate the idea of a scared, confused human trying to conform to an old tradition and then feeling bad about themselves in the process. Like, it makes me furious, actually. You know, the fact, like, life is hard enough. You don't need religion and old spiritual traditions to make you feel worse about yourself. So, like, whatever spiritual tradition there is, it should serve the individual 100%. The idea of prostrating yourself and, like, beating yourself and feeling bad because you're not conforming to a 5,000-year-old tradition, that's nonsense. Like, I feel like, again, not to anthropomorphize God, but whoever God is like, just stop it. Like, go play with puppies and eat an orange and stop making yourself feel bad because you can't do this old meditation tradition or spiritual tradition.
I'm thinking now from the perspective of the audience, it would come out as if the book has a lot about meditation and veganism and animal rights. Like, it would come out as if it's a book that's kind of very, very preachy. It's not. The book has a very different take, and in fact, all of those things, I guess, happened when the book ends. In the last line says, then I started basically my next phase, which you're going to hear about in the third book, I assume. The book has the opposite, and I want to demonstrate that by asking a question that I didn't think I'm going to ask. Have you ever rubbed your penis on Donald Trump?
Well, let's contextualize it a little bit.
Yes.
So the year was 2001. I was battling a lot. I was very confused. Drinking a lot, doing a lot of drugs. I found myself at a party on Park Avenue, and I was with my friends Lee and Dale, and we were talking about this game that they played when they were at Parsons called Knob Touch, where they would drunkenly walk around a room with their penis hanging out of their pants, flaccid. And the goal was to just brush up against random people. Not sexual, random, boys, girls, didn't matter, just random people. It's the stupidest, dumbest game ever invented. And my date challenged me. She was like, have you ever played this? And I was like, no. And she said, well, we're here, why don't you go knob touch someone? So, to your point, which is quite germane, the only person I have brushed my flaccid penis up against is currently in the White House, rage tweeting at someone.
Well, this is live on Facebook, so it's at you right now.
Oh no, I confessed it. When I was on Bill Maher the other night, I confessed it there. So Donald, if you're watching Facebook Live, I feel like technically that's probably a bit above your pay grade or your competence. Yeah, Donald, I rubbed my flaccid penis up against you, and guess what? You wouldn't even know about it. Because that's the whole thing about knob touch. You rub up against someone, and they're oblivious.
Yeah.
So one of my hopes, might be a little politically incorrect, is I really do hope he kind of tries to Me Too me. You know, I mean, be kind of like having like Stalin accuse you of being a bad person.
I just want to make the audience understand that the nature of the book, that it's not just about animal rights, but it also has other...
It's just filled with bottoming out. Like, I mean, it gets so dark. It's grim. I mean, like, another thing that I was hesitant to include, but it really did serve a point. It's like, there's one moment right before I got sober. It was the anniversary of my mom's death, and after a crazy night, I woke up freezing cold and sick on a tour bus covered in poop. I still don't know whose poop it was. So, the book is in the gutter. It's not like, I mean, this is far more elevated than anything that's actually in the book. So we're kind of misrepresenting.
Yeah, that's my
like
fear.
all these nice people are going to be like, oh, I'm going to go read this interesting erudite book. It's a meditation on like spirituality and the intersection of like quantum mechanics and meditation. Like, nope. It's doing cocaine for the first time in a strip club and bottoming out and terrible things coming out of me, literally and figuratively.
But so, since we spoke about politics in passing, you spend a lot of time on various causes. Animal rights is one. There are a few that I read about that I'm curious about right now that are not in the book. One of them is Putin's agents asking you to comment on that? Explain to me. I wasn't sure I understood it correctly.
Over the years, I've managed to make a few friends who used to work in different intelligence agencies. And after Trump was elected and Chris Steele submitted the, what's that company? The company in the UK he worked for. They're the bad ones.
He was a dossier.
Fusion GPS. So Chris did a report for Fusion GPS, went to the FBI, and some friends of mine who used to work in different intelligence agencies around the world said, this report is 99% accurate. Trump is a Russian agent. And these are not dilettantes. These are not like crazy left-wing, like intercept dilettantes. Like these are like hardcore career intelligence agents. And they're like, Trump is a Russian agent. He's being owned and run by Russia. As if it's a fact. They're not like, maybe that's the case. They're like, no, it's the fact. And so they asked me to post about it, to say, because they understood Trump really wants to be a wartime president. And they're like, most likely he will try to develop some sort of conflict with Iran or Venezuela. And look what's happened in the last 6 months. He's desperately trying to go to war with Iran and or Venezuela. He wants to be a wartime president. He also wants to disrupt the oil supply because all of his, like, just imagine what happens if you short like oil production and we go to war with Venezuela or Iran. The price of oil or maybe not, short, whatever, long, whatever they do with commodities.
The thing that makes the go.
That one. So it's so dark, and like it makes me wonder why these Republicans are supporting Trump, because when the truth comes out, how are Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell and all these people, they're like, they knew. Not only is he like a serial sexual abuser and a pathological liar and a sociopath, he's a foreign agent.
You actually know, in the book it appears, you know Putin's daughter.
Over the years I've met a whole bunch of people.
Including her.
I mean, Ivanka and I hosted a fundraiser for the Museum of Natural History. Like, I have a sordid past.
And one of the people that I saw also that you're helping is Chelsea Manning, who's also in prison right now and getting some difficult times from the government. What gets you into those causes? The people reach out to you, it's because in your life you just encountered all of them and you said, I'm going to keep all of those involved, or is recently you were actually interested in changing the world and it's becoming a big priority of your day-to-day?
I mean, like, there is a presumptuous underpinning, which is like the idea that the world is in trouble and somehow it could be made better. You know, like, who knows? Maybe chaos theory is such that the world is exactly as it needs to be. But in my sort of like dim human perspective, I think that the world doesn't need to be as badly run as it currently is. And I think that there are a lot of like choices that we make where we just seem to be making egregiously terrible choices. You know, like, imagine we have a tabula rasa for energy production. And someone says, okay, here's option 1. We have the sun and we have the wind. They're free and they're abundant and no pollution is created. Alternately, we can dig deep below the Gulf of Mexico and dredge up this sticky black tar, destroy the oceans, and destroy our climate in the process. Which would we choose? Or food-wise, you can either like take grain and feed it to people, or take the grain, feed it to livestock, torture them in the process, kill them, create diabetes, obesity, cancer, heart disease, antibiotic resistance, and destroy the rainforest for this industry. Like, we're just making these terribly stupid choices. And presumptuously, I think we could do better. And if I can have a hand in that, like, either like supporting politicians, supporting campaigns, supporting NGOs and nonprofits, like, it's a much better use of my time and whatever money I have and my limited public figure status. Like, I'd rather do that than get stuff for myself. You know, I mean, I'm selfish and I like being comfortable, but like the problems of the world, I was going to say trump that, but like certainly like take priority over any of my really like parochial selfish concerns.
So I'm going to add my science to that. I wanted to add an optimistic message, and this was a great one. So I'll add one to that, and then we open it to the audience to ask questions, which is that a lot of the difficulties that you listed in our world right now, climate change and food, actually, in my mind, are a brain problem. It's the case that our brain, humans' brain, is the best out there in looking and thinking about the future. Compared to all other animals out there, we're the best in seeing to the future. We have an entire part of the brain that's made for that, to imagine futures and think how they're going to look like. Yet, we're still terrible at that. So even though we are the best out of the other animals, we're still terrible. It's very hard for us to imagine the future. When someone asks you to imagine yourself in 50 years, you basically think it's me right now, I'm just labeled 50 years older.
It's one of the benefits of being bald. I kind of have an idea of what I'll look like in 50 years.
So one of them is, actually one of the experiments that makes people do a better job is one where someone actually creates a computer graphics of them looking older, usually involves changing their features, and when they see themselves looking older by 50 years, the computer can do that, they actually become a little bit better in thinking about themselves. But the bottom line is that it's really, really hard. And that is why people have a hard time saving for pension or saving for later days, because they kind of say, well, by then things are going to look different. I'm not going to worry about that. But also, when it comes to climate change or changing the planet, we kind of say, well, it's going to be my great-grandkids, if anything, and whatever I do is drop in the bucket. People find it hard to imagine. So in a way, investing in the science of teaching us how the brain works could be a way to teach everyone, if they don't believe, about a way to do a better job in imagining the future.
I 100% agree. If there was more than 100%, I would more than 100% agree, is that every problem stems from that. You know, we have our prefrontal cortex, when it's engaged, can engage in executive sort of futuristic thinking. Our culture does not live in the prefrontal cortex. You know, we live like way back there with the amygdala, where it's like fear, you know, fight someone over a parking space, give me that Twinkie, give me that Big Mac. You know,
New York Times writers.
Yeah.
All of those.
So yeah, actually, I mean, like if you could magically heal everyone's brains so that everybody started behaving in like rational, enlightened ways with like foresight, all these problems would disappear. We'd be like, why are we doing this? You know, like, why are we destroying the only home we have? What fascinates me even more is the priority, the way in which the brain can paradoxically create like these narratives that are 180 degrees opposed to each other, but they each make us feel good. My favorite, and I'm sorry if this makes you uncomfortable, animal lovers who eat meat. You can't. It's like you can't love children and be a pedophile. It's just not, these things are inconsistent. Like if you love animals, you cannot contribute to their suffering and death. Like, that's not possible. But yet, I did that until I was 19 years old. I was like, oh, I loved our rescued dogs and cats, but I loved Burger King. But they both made me feel good. Or, pre-sobriety, this might make you laugh, I would go to Whole Foods and I would not buy broccoli if it wasn't organic. But I would go down to Ludlow Street and do bags of drugs that were given to me by complete strangers. Because they both made me feel good. I was like, the narrative, what it's told me about myself, I was like, I am a good person who only eats organic broccoli, but boy, do I love that white powder that stranger just sold me behind Max Fish. So that paradigm, if we can heal that, you know, I don't know if it's hemispheric or what, but like, because up until recently, our brains were able to create meaning from dopamine and serotonin. You know, for a long time, like dopamine and serotonin told us what was good for our survival. And now, dopamine and serotonin are killing us. So,
optimistic ending. Say something optimistic.
Optimistic. We'll all be dead soon.
Let's take questions.
Thank you both. We do have a little bit of time for questions. We have mics on either side of the house. We don't have too much time, so please keep it succinct if you can. Maybe we can raise the house lights a little bit so we can see these hands. Allison, we've got someone here in the center.
Oh, getting the mic to the middle, that's going to take a while. So you teach at Northwestern?
I do.
Why is that in Chicago?
Fortunately, I hope this is not seen by many of my colleagues. Unfortunately, I spend most of my time here in New York.
Okay. No, I mean, I love Chicago, but I just never, the western part always confused me because, like, I live in California now for the most part. Like, I live in Brooklyn in California because I am a full-on cliche. Like, Park Slope in Los Feliz. Like, I'd punch me in the face, too. But it always confused me. Like, was Northwestern named, like, before the Louisiana Purchase? How did that...
I have no answer. I asked myself the same question, but never bothered to check. So that's how.
But I guess then again, in LA, we have a street called Western, but it's in East Hollywood. So like, okay. I was just killing time until the microphone ended up somewhere.
So a very simple question, and you started actually already answering that question. You seem like a citizen of the Earth or even this universe. You're not like just a U.S. citizen, I think. And my question is, what is your favorite place on this Earth, if there is any? If it's
my favorite
US,
place?
And metaphorically or geographically?
Boy, oh boy.
If there is any.
You know, I would if I had it, I want to answer you in like a beautiful Sufi way. And I'm not a Sufi, but it's a quote from I think it's a Kabir poem.
Okay.
But if I read it, I would start crying, so I can't. Also, thank God I don't have it, because I don't want to, I'm like all in favor of being honest, as long as it doesn't involve true vulnerability. Okay. So, favorite physical place? Anywhere with a lot of trees where people don't like to go.
Gotcha. On the same page here.
Like, like Canada, the Pacific Northwest. My apartment in Brooklyn, I'm right by Prospect Park, and the reason I'm there is because of the woods in Prospect Park. I went for a walk on Saturday, and if you remember, Saturday was like 74 degrees and perfect, and Prospect Park was like a fucking rave. I mean, there was like, it was just like people everywhere. The moment you go into the forest, no one. And that was so that, like being in the presence of trees where there are no people, I mean, I guess it's a little odd being a person, so technically I ruin it the moment I show up, kind of like my dating life. And so trees and nature without people.
I totally agree with you. Thank you.
Sir?
So it's interesting when you mentioned about the rat experiment, where they had to choose between food sustenance or the dopamine hit, and then the social option. But these days, as our lives become a lot more digital, and there are far less opportunities for people to have contact with other people. Like, for example, I had an old coworker who got a date off of the unemployment line back in the 80s, but nowadays if you're unemployed, you just file for it online. So as less and less people are within the proximity of other people, how could you deal with the fact that people are tempted to fall into various addictions when left to their own devices?
Left their own devices, that's a clever play on words.
So it's a tough one. I'm on the camp that it is a challenge. To the people who watch us on Facebook, you're in trouble by that. So I think it's a challenge. Like, we live in a world that has a lot of temptations, and in many ways, keeping with the theme of the evening, this is another type of drug. It's just that we didn't label it this way yet. We're starting to see that it has the same effect. We're seeing that a lot of the companies that do that hire my students, neuroscience students, to work for them on finding ways to make a person use it more. So it's not surprising in my mind that Facebook and Google and Amazon and Twitter, they hire neuroscientists to work right now on their teams on finding ways to make it kind of more addictive and keep you there longer. It's at the expense of social interactions. It's difficult. I don't have a good answer other than at some point I believe people are going to realize that, and they're going to start treating that the same way we treated cigarettes back in the days, alcohol and other substances, by saying you're going to have a meeting that helps you stop using that.
It already exists. There are like actual 12-step meetings for people who are addicted to technology. So the one thing I would add to that is, but the brain doesn't know any different. Like, the brain knows its neurochemical reaction. It doesn't know what's triggering it. You know, it doesn't know if it's cocaine, a healthy conversation, Facebook, Angry Birds, whatever, all the brain knows is how it feels. And that, because I recently tried a brand new cutting edge virtual reality set. We're done. We are, like, I was like, I now know what it's like to go scuba diving with sharks. I put it on. It was more real than almost anything I've experienced. Like, it was
Not only that, but it's also undoing years of evolution. So all of you probably, as soon as you were born, if someone put you at the corner of a cliff, let's say, and you look down, without being told what it is, you would feel scared. Your brain is going to exhibit the symptoms of fear. In VR, you can actually play this game. You put the goggles, and you are placed in the front of a top building, and you're asked to make a step. And it's scary, and you feel afraid to do that, and you don't want to do it, but then someone says, just try, and you do that. And then you don't fall because it's VR. And at that moment, your brain changed, and you start a process of undoing all the years of evolution where people who did it before didn't get to live. So you're the descendant of all people who didn't do that. And now, for the first time, you actually change that in your life. So pretty bad.
It's like me doing exposure therapy with cocaine. Should we? I see it. The time is getting away from us.
Yes.
Yes, we'll take one more question, and then I'll leave you on the stage to play. I think there's people who definitely want
Yes,
that.
I think someone
to be
has a mic
main thing.
already. Yes, thank you.
Hey, Moby, I just wanted to say thank you so much for your really thoughtful answers tonight. And just to go back to the topic of paradox that you were talking about before, I'm intrigued to hear you mention VR and like, we're done. But then in the face of that, you still are such an outspoken and powerful advocate on behalf of so many causes. And that's something that I really respect about you. I work in professional farmed animal advocacy, and the organization I work for really prizes effectiveness. So what I'm curious to know from you is, through your experience of being an activist, an advocate, a supporter, all of these things, do you have thoughts or intuitions about what you think is most effective on behalf of farmed animals? Especially also curious to hear your perspective, like for you as an individual, because as you mentioned, like the paradox or the cognitive dissonance, right, runs so deep of all the like animal lovers who eat animals, etc.
And I love that question. And when I say that there's that paradox of like loving animals and eating animals, I'm not criticizing. Because I was that way for quite a long time. And like I have lots of hypocritical paradoxes, if that's the right plural for paradox, some paradoxes. So to that, what's wonderful about being an animal rights activist is we sometimes call animal rights activism the Swiss Army knife of activism. Because you can go out and you can talk to someone and you can say like, oh, are you interested in climate change? Let's talk about the role of animal agriculture in climate change. That it's the third leading cause of climate change. It's 90% of rainforest deforestation is attributable to animal agriculture. And then over here, someone who's interested in life extension. You're like, oh, according to Nobel laureates, the number one way of extending your life expectancy is adopting a whole food plant-based diet. And then over here, someone who loves animals saying, oh, you know that warm, beautiful feeling you have when you see like an innocent deer or an innocent puppy? Let me show you a baby cow and see how you have that same emotion. So it's almost like healing, like with the limbic system, healing that paradox or expanding it, you know, and saying like the part of people that love dogs, that love kittens, that love baby deers, that's the best part of them, expanding it and say like, include all of creation in that. You know, don't just compartmentalize it, A, for the benefit of creation, but also for your own spiritual benefit. Like, why be stingy with compassion? You know? So all these reasons, it's like, that's what's so exciting about being an animal rights activist, is there's so many different ways to reach people.
I'm going to leaving you to play music. It was fantastic, and I love the book. Thank you so much.
By the way, Kelly, are you here? Yeah. Oh, you are? Okay. Where? Oh, way back there. Okay. Hi. That's my friend Kelly. She's going to come up and sing a song. Your hair changed color. What? It did.